the questions of what is socialism, what is the role of the class-wide program, what is the worldwide socialist program, and I'll say a little bit less about tactics because I think that's about the amount I can cover, but I hope to get to those in the QA. And I'll use some examples of the problems and the social ills of the United States in particular, because that's my greatest area of familiarity, but I'll try to make clear why those have to be addressed in an internationalist way. So with that, so what I see is that in the next 20 years or more, we will be in a period of great crisis worldwide. Unfolding environmental catastrophes, we don't know their extent or when how far they will continue. A financial instability of the major world markets based on massive debt, unprecedented levels of this, a falling rate of profit, an absence of useful investment in many of the major economies, and general stagnation. We are seeing in some countries a kind of growth without development, where we have more and more of everything and extensively building, but not in a way that improves the lives of the people who are using these things. No qualitative development, and this extensive development in the end threatens the earth. And that is what capitalism is offering us right now. Along with, of course, the possibility of major wars. We haven't seen such major wars in some time, but these very likely at some point. As well, we have the situation that what has been called in the last decade or so left-wing social democracy is at an impasse. It was attempted to bring some of these more left-wing caucuses to power in various European countries or through the Bernie Sanders movement. And this has, I would say, stagnated and has also had many of the problems of this electoral approach that have existed throughout the 20th century. So at least I would argue that the evolutionary socialist path is blocked right now, as it has been in the past. The reforms and electoral movements, of course, we welcome reforms, but their potential is limited and oftentimes deceptive. And I would say the future welfare of life on Earth depends on our success here, because it declines significantly each year that we continue in this way. The degree of environmental devastation that eventually will face us mounts year by year. So this is the context for my first question I will get to, which is, what is socialism? It's an economy and society based on the fulfillment of all human needs, rather than the satisfaction of profit as in capitalism. It is an economy based on planning, which overcomes the scarcities of the market in order to fulfill these needs. And it organizes our work, our human activities without wage labor, eliminates wage labor and eliminates class differences. These are the ultimate goals of socialism. It is an international system of economy, not a national development of particular factories and so forth, but builds upon what progress capitalism has offered us in international connections and preserves that. It is also internationalist. Decisions are made by and for people across the world, eliminating borders and allowing people to cross them freely, not by any particular national leader, for example. Parts of this vision are sometimes termed communism or the higher stage of socialism, something like that. Karl Marx, in his critique of the Gotha program, said he didn't make clear these stages of socialism and communism in the way that is sometimes presented, but he said there would be a very prolonged transition period, and then it would be extremely difficult for us to cross this threshold and make the changes necessary to actually have a socialist society. He called this the period, the dictatorship of the proletariat, or we could call it the period of the working class in power. And this happens as a result of a revolution and expropriation of the capitalists. Likely we will discuss the first steps towards this, not the actual revolution, for example, a bit later on. Okay, some versions may call this period socialism, where there's a continuing existence of labor, even with wages. But whatever it is, it has to actually be a transition. It has to be moving towards socialism, not to state capitalism, not to a ramified welfare state, not to a bureaucratized, nationalized economy. although some of those things will happen on the way. So I want to address the needs and ills that a socialist transition will have to overcome, again, particularly with reference to the US, because we need to understand the tendencies and transformations in which the working class will have to move towards socialism in this century. All right, so I'll speak next to what will be the economic foundation for this transition and where would the US fit in. So in 2021 and in the past 2 years, we've seen COVID basically unleashing the breakdown of the satisfaction of human needs in advanced capitalist societies and throughout the world, including the need for life, the ability for people to survive. We're right now racked supposedly by the idea of inflation. And this, I think, illustrates the international character of the economy. Inflation actually is not so much a matter of workers receiving higher wages right now, but as has been shown by various articles, it's a result of markups by capitalists. Capitalists are simply charging more to try to capture profits that they feel they were entitled to or lost over the past decades when there's been deflation, a fall in prices often caused by competition from cheaper producers. And capitalists are trying to capture that by raising prices as much as they think they can get away with and doing it all collectively and at the same time. But another cause of this inflation has been asset inflation, the run-up of the prices of stocks, financial assets, and especially housing and real estate, which has led to rent inflation, which increases everyone's expenses, especially workers, much more often than particular commodities being inflated. And the breakdown of the supply chain during the COVID crisis. So the US has been shown not to produce basic commodities that it requires, and their prices accelerate greatly when the supply chain begins to break down, as it has. These things show crucially how the transition to socialism must be based on an international economy. We don't want to rebuild, industrial capacity, duplicative industrial capacity in the US to replace everything that would come from the supply chain and have an autarkic economy of some sort. And we can't afford that environmentally at all. As well, commodities, and especially imported commodities, although they're a very large share of the commodities we have, they form a shrinking share of the working class budget. So we are not in the US, in fact, although the US massively exploits labor in other countries, living on the work of 200 million or so low-paid workers abroad. Most of the work that's done in the US is in other sectors, service sectors and so forth, and that is what US workers are spending their time on, quite needlessly and wastefully, as I will argue. US capitalism largely wastes the lives of its production on these internal unproductive pursuits and results in these morbid symptoms of our social life, of despair, political derangement, violence, and so forth. We see a cultural impoverishment of much of the United States, and I'm sure in other countries as well, where rural areas and urban areas are each made distorted and incomplete, environments in which to live, each of which have inadequate standards of living in very different ways. In urban areas, a shortage of space, a compression and constant stress. In rural areas, a bit more space, a bit easier to get around with cars and so forth, but a lack of sort of the cultural facilities that and the diversity of human pursuits that we used to have, or which we are more accustomed to in cities. And I think the segmentation and sectionalization of our society based on education levels and political attitudes is quite damaging consequences. That one of the things that socialism must overcome is to bridge these divides. So we need a social reconstruction of society to be able to continue toward a higher level of socialist transition. First, of course, we need to address our reliance on carbon and mitigate climate change. We need to replace carbon in electricity generation. We need to remove the need for gasoline for commuting and for shipping of goods. We need public transport and improved rail systems. Second, in the US, we'll have to address the housing shortage, partly through new construction of housing, so people aren't so horribly crammed together and must pay so much for rent. but also redistribution of the spaces that we have, redistribution of the large and capitalist properties, both residential and commercial. Third, we need to address the wasteful use of our time in advanced capitalist labor markets and tasks that only have uses because of the specific social arrangements of capitalism. This has been called socially necessary, unproductive labor, work needed for and specific to the capitalist system as a social organization, but not materially necessary, doesn't increase our quality of life. Examples include the police, security, military, much of what lawyers do, insurance, banking, advertising, retail, etc. I actually want to work on a method to measure exactly what portion of the labor that goes on in a country like the US is devoted to these things, because in socialism, we won't have them, or they'll be pretty close to unrecognizable. There'll be certain kinds of white collar jobs involved in planning the economy, but not the ones that capitalism has created or has trained people to do. Meanwhile, capitalists are trying to reduce all these forms of work with technology, computer applications that replace secretarial work, surveillance. Amazon, the company, eliminates perhaps millions of retail jobs, which is in a way efficient and almost desirable to the future society, that we don't need people sitting around, but we certainly don't want people working in Amazon warehouses in the way that is organized. But capitalists then create layers of management to capture more profits and force workers into new kinds of unproductive work. So now we have the medical management industry and proliferation of corporate bureaucracy. It doesn't seem that capitalism will ever really reduce the amount of sort of necessary but useless labor that it has come to demand. Whole professions of specialists devote their time to applying for grants, justifying expenditures, putting lines on their resumes, and other things that interfere with education, and they interfere with the advancement of science. So I would argue that a part of socialism is that workers need to gain control over their work processes so that they can choose how to use time efficiently and produce things well and in good quality. Teachers, for example, need not to be bound to the bureaucratic curricula and the testing requirements and so forth, which both reduce the quality of education and make their working day very onerous. What we need is a comprehensive plan to eliminate some of these kinds of work, replace them with more useful ones, and eliminate whole sectors of the economy that are wasteful and oppressive. The lockdowns of the last 2 years and the phenomenon of necessary workers have shown just how little of the labor in the US is really crucial from a certain perspective. The middle class work from home phenomenon, largely made up of what would be classified as unproductive workers in Marxist value theory, show to a great extent things that simply could be done in a more efficient way. And people making their own coffee and meals and so forth would form a better form of organization. So I believe we may be discussing a demand for jobs for all, and I certainly support that. But these need to be new kinds of jobs. And more directly, what we've seen is that people are choosing to work less, and even without retaining their wages, but they should have a 35-hour week, indeed a 32-hour week, a 30-hour week, and a 20-hour week at the same wages. That is the direction that capitalism is going, that is the direction our production systems are going, because they don't need all that labor. It is not the direction that capitalism is going. It is impeding this development. In the past year, we've seen what's called the Great Resignation. People, especially young people, see that there's no purpose or growth to the kinds of careers that are available to them. There may be a higher standard of living possible with less work, even with lower income. And they see no larger task or destination for our society's work. Capitalism is seen to be in stagnation and approaching a dead end, except perhaps for tech companies and millionaires, often seen as a decadent society. And this leads to, both among capitalists and in other classes, nihilism and sociopathic selfishness. And much of politics then become premised on this nihilism and this selfishness. By the way, my view is that the economic struggle of American workers for higher wages in unions is, of course, very, very positive, but it has shown limits, and its direction towards a social democratic party has not led to revolutionary politics and progress towards socialism in quite a while. Not to say we should not support these things, but we have to be realistic that other ways of engaging in social struggle may be more promising. So my hope is that addressing these kinds of inequalities and providing time for personal growth will mitigate the psychological and political morbid symptoms of the present age. And beyond treating the ills of unproductive dead-end capitalism, what tasks should be set for a transition to socialism? Well, first, I think internationalism is key. We should decide these directions by an international plan, and the associated producers of the socialist future, that is the working class around the world, should be involved and should have a say, including what the US economy does. Controlling what productive decisions are made should be useful to the rest of the world because the needs of the US have been relatively more satisfied. There is, of course, no democratic process, much less a rational socialist planning system to determine what the rest of the world's workers may wish for US socialists to focus on. However, we have some clear indications, basic demands that are obvious and have to be satisfied. We have to reduce and mitigate carbon and its effects, including through clean energy and perhaps public transport, rail infrastructure, and so forth. We need to use our productive capacity to improve standards of living worldwide, and we have to accommodate more people in the US, especially in the course of climate change, with a higher standard of living, and that means open borders. The same would be said for Europe and Japan. We need to reconstruct healthcare worldwide, and I'm saying that we need a system of socialist reconstruction. Reconstruction of our social systems should be our view. Through provision, healthcare to be reconstructed, through provision of medications and technology and building safe water and housing situations throughout the world. We need to reconstruct US agriculture, which has a disproportionate share of arable land in the world, to use less land, but more efficiently, eliminating some of the more wasteful things we have, like cattle ranching and growing corn to feed pigs, but producing higher quality products to feed more people, perhaps requiring more labor even, and at higher wages. And we need to reconstruct our advanced industry to some extent to supply tools that may be needed for development everywhere else, and diverting production from weapons, excessive aerospace production, luxury uses, and other things that the relatively advanced manufacturers that still are in the US tend to produce. I'm getting close to the end, if that's a question. Part of how I would frame this is as a matter of reparations, and not even as a moral imperative, although that might be justified, but reparations not only to Black population, formerly enslaved people, but victims of imperialism around the world, and those who have been exploited for all kinds of reasons. Not simply to redistribute capitalist property and to give financial assets or money, but to give meaningful control and a role in decisions of our socialist planning of the future, so that we can have and make use of the full capacity of humanity and the full capacity of workers. It's a matter of interest that we should revise our system of decision-making in this way. And this is the condition for everyone's ability to have a socialist future in which we can engage in more rewarding and self-developing activities than mundane work, and also set tasks beyond what capitalism has been able to accomplish, something in order to give a direction to humanity or a direction to individuals, so that they feel more integrated. So I'll close with a quote from, I think, the manifesto: "The free development of each is the condition for the free development of all." And that is an argument of solidarity. It is an altruistic argument, but it is not only an altruistic argument. The solidarity says that it must be that everyone is able to develop in order for each of us to develop. Because societies in poverty cannot preserve the environment as needs to happen. Because the existence of exploitation anywhere means there will be powerful enemies to social progress, and there will be powerful enemies to socialism. So we must remove that exploitation to make progress. And finally, the positive basis or interpretation of this quote is that we should set social tasks higher than what we are presently capable of, not only to free our time to pursue the arts and things, but to do things socially on a large scale that we would like to imagine are possible. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Okay.